Hello, I'm James Warren.
And I'm Andy Cushen.
And this is the Denver Urbanism Podcast, a podcast on all things city building in the liberal city of Denver.
So, James, I wonder if you were paying attention last week when we had this little election?
An election like benefits, like healthcare elections at work?
It
was open enrollment. Yeah, I was paying attention.
It was open enrollment for national politics, I suppose you could call it. And we had a little election. I wonder if you were paying attention and saw.
I was, yes. I was following it pretty closely. We had some friends over to watch it. A somber evening, to be sure, but I was paying very close attention that night, yes.
Well, I was paying very close attention too, and we thought it might be of interest to the audience to just talk through some of the local ballot issues, the state ballot issues, and the national politicians that might have an effect on how we do city building in the city and county of Denver.
Yeah, definitely. I think that there's so much to talk about with an election, and that's not our bag. We are here to talk about urbanist things. We are here to talk about roads and housing, and maybe dialing in a little bit on those things will help some of our listeners understand the stakes of the election that just happened and hopefully what to expect over the coming years here in Denver, here in the state, and nationally.
Well, dear listener, if you were just a total optimist for the state of the world and the state of urbanism, I have to tell you this obviously was not the ideal outcome. Right. And we'll break down a couple of ways. But let's just kind of set store here, right? When James and I talk about urbanism, we're mostly talking about, for instance, Vision Zero, the ability for people to safely, peacefully move around the city in anything that is not a private motor vehicle driving alone. The convenience of that as well. We're talking about taking climate action and, reducing or ceasing carbon pollution in our cities and just generally reducing pollution in our cities. And then I think the other one that we talk about a lot is housing. We haven't done exclusively a housing episode, but we keep hitting on it. Those are very important issues. Most of them are decided at the local level. So we're going to start by talking about local politics. But let's just give a flavor of how much money we're really kind of talking about here. So locally, we have a general fund, and the general fund is $1.76 billion. That's a lot of money that the city and county of Denver spends in the general fund. We also have special revenue funds that happen from sales taxes, and obviously, the school board spends its own money and stuff like that. But when you divide that general fund by the number of people who live in the city, you get a number of around $2,450 a person. So that's how much money is being spent on you. In various ways, right? Salaries and obviously programs. There's some concrete going into the ground, but there's a lot of ways that money is spent. At the federal level, the federal government just has so much more money than the city and county of Denver does. And so the federal government, when you divide by the number of people who live in this country, the federal government spends $19,434 per person, or they did in 2022, which was a record high. Obviously, some of that's military. There's sort of things the federal government does that the state government, local government don't do. But when you break down, for instance, specifically for grants that go to local and state government, you get $3,707 per person. And that's for Medicaid, children's health insurance, transportation services, education services, child and social services. So that happens in a lot of ways, but just in general, there's so much money that happens at the federal level that filters down to us in the city. So that's kind of why we're spending some time on this.
Yeah, and I think that as we look at the outcomes of this election and focus pretty locally, right? A lot of the stuff that's going to affect our day-to-day existence, and certainly the stuff that affects us as urbanists is hyper-local. But you make a really good point that there's so much money at a federal level that this should come as no surprise to anyone. It's pretty consequential who's in charge. But let's dive into some of that local stuff. Mm-hmm. We had the opportunity to vote on a number of ballot issues this election, and some of the stuff is pretty cool. So we're not going to cover stuff like the slaughterhouse. That's important. Of course, that affects how people work, that affects certain land uses. But ultimately we're focused more on the sort of classically urbanist stuff. So let's start off with ballot issue 4A. This was $1 billion for Denver public schools. That passed. I think it's pretty cool, right? It's a bond. They're not raising additional taxes or anything like that, so most of us will not really feel this in a day-to-day experience. The only reason I brought this up specifically was because on episode 1, we covered how air conditioning was installed at Fairview Elementary after they closed the school down. And a lot of the money in this $1 billion bond is for air conditioning additional Denver public schools. So I have no doubt that they are going to do a great job of air conditioning and building up infrastructure for Denver public schools. But I thought that was a pretty funny connection to our first episode. And I see you shaking your head in disgust at the Fairview case.
I mean, still very upset about the Fairview situation. I think it's just worth considering Denver public schools at sort of a focused level. But I'll just say that it is nice to see that the city wasn't split on this one, right? Yeah. Most people don't actively have a school-age child.
Right.
Most people listening to this podcast, the vast majority of the population in the city does not have a school-age child. But 70% of voters voted to approve this bond.
Right.
So we do generally want to support Denver public schools. There also was a state ballot initiative that would have sort of enshrined a right to school choice, which is a movement that really started here in Denver. That failed. So there is a groundswell of support for Denver public schools that sort of we felt here locally when we passed a bond measure. There's so much more to say about the closure process that, Denver Public Schools is going to do. Keep your eye on that list of schools that they want to close, and keep your eye on that list of schools that they proposed for critical upgrades. But Denver supports Denver Public Schools.
Speaking of something that Denver was a lot more split on, the Affordable Housing Ballot Measure, 2R, that Mayor Johnston was a big proponent of, failed very, very narrowly. What do you think happened there?
I think you could have really replayed this election in a couple different ways, and that ballot measure would have passed. I'll say my own sort of political theory here moving forward, right, is in a world where locally the fairly blue voters in Denver don't like what's happening at a federal level, we become more supportive of local action and local policy. And so I think if you could kind of whisper into everyone's dreams the morning before November 5th across the entire city and county of Denver and say, Trump is going to win all of the swing states. If you were able to do that, I do actually think voters would have woken up that morning and said, you know what, then we should have more money here locally. $100 million would have been a lot. $100 million isn't enough. Right. No one in this process, the mayor, none of the supporters of this bill said, this is enough. And so we're just going to have to go back to the drawing board. What other policies do we have in place that can increase the housing supply? Some of this money would have increased the housing supply. Some of it wouldn't have increased the housing supply. It would have just changed, I think, the nature of how we consider affordable housing preservation and goal setting in the city. But there is also still state money, the federal money, which I'll talk about, 20 minutes from now, I think generally has a bigger impact. So again, pretty narrow.
Another thing that I heard from some housing advocates, people who I traditionally would have assumed would have supported more money for housing, is that they would have liked to see this paired with additional changes to things like the zoning code, removing restrictions citywide so that anyone can build a quadplex instead of a single family unit and not have to go through the quite arduous process of rezoning, and allowing for more density across the city, which housing advocates and myself believe is going to increase the housing supply, which is the solution to a housing demand problem. So I think that there was some reticence from giving full-throated support for this from some housing advocates, which obviously we don't have a time machine, but if we could go back and the mayor's office had focused more on zoning and on increasing supply generally, I wonder whether it would have had enough of an effect to push it past the finish line.
I mean, something like this it's so up to chance. I mean, honestly, if we had gotten a snowstorm a couple days earlier and certain people hadn't gone to the polls on that day, it could have passed. Or it could have failed by a way bigger margin. So when it's that close, it's kind of tough to tell. I don't think that the mayor's lost support in any meaningful way. I just think that people are skeptical and need to be convinced of that particular approach. And there are a lot of tools still on the table. An initiative that did pass, though, and it wasn't particularly close, was a different sales tax measure. And I just want to shout it out because I think it's a big deal. 2Q, which raised, I think it's 0.33% on sales tax for Denver Health. It's really, really important in Denver. We are a regional center For 1,000 miles around, you can't find hospital systems like we have here in Denver. And I think I've heard a lot in the reporting saying, oh, Denver Health Safety Net Hospital, etc. Okay, but when you break your leg in Leadville, Colorado, if the local clinic doesn't have space for you that day, the closest place that they take you is they take you all the way down to Denver. I mean, it's like a 3-hour ambulance situation to get you down to Denver for critical care. We serve so many more people than just the city and county alone. So I'm really glad to see voters actually understand and appreciate that we need a strong hospital system here in the city. This is also bringing us closer, as the point was made often, to kind of national averages for state and local support for public hospitals. So yeah, that was a big win, I think. Also has to do with Denver Public Schools. They have clinics in Denver Public Schools. They operate a lot of really interesting services. So Denver Health is a great organization, and I don't think that cuts to the hospital would have made this a stronger or more resilient city.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because when we talk about money not fixing systemic issues on the side of housing, it's like, well, we have the tools locally to fix some of these systemic issues, maybe not all of them, but many of them. When it comes to healthcare, Denver Health has no power to enact universal health care that would be a fix to the system. They can't say tomorrow, hey, everybody, we're a single payer system now. And so on some level, I think money, even in a broken system like that, is going to uplift the quality of service and just the amount of service that they can provide. Mm-hmm. Now, we're going to talk about one more, and I think it is, in some ways, the most exciting to me. This was ballot measure 6A. And if you're listening to this, chances are you did not see it on your ballot.
If one of you had this on your ballot, call in, please.
Right.
But none of you had this on your ballot. It was only like 800 people that voted on this. So Measure 6A essentially reauthorizes and extends the sort of boundaries of the Downtown Development Authority, which is a development authority. It's a sort of special taxing district that is allowed by state law. You can only have one per city. We already have one in Denver. And it issued debt that was needed in order to do the public improvements for Union Station. And then by using tax increment financing and taking a portion of the tax that's sort of larger now than it was pre-development in Union Station, it paid back that debt early. And rather than let it expire and thus have to create a brand new DDA from scratch, we're essentially just extending the existing authority, giving, I don't know, it's a huge amount of money per year. And ultimately, they're authorized to spend like $500 million in downtown. So this is money that's going to go directly for downtown priorities. A certain slice of downtown. There's some parts of downtown like Golden Triangle and, kind of up by the ballpark that don't necessarily get this money. It has to be pretty narrowly defined as the central business district in state law. Anyhow, a fantastic opportunity to spend some more money downtown without raising any taxes. There's another part of this too. It's a very clever tool that doesn't raise taxes. I'm a big fan. We're going to have to do a whole episode about this because it's going to be a big deal.
Yeah, I agree. We'll definitely need an episode on this. And I think one of the cool things about this is that nobody goes to Union Station and says, wow, they really did a bad job here, right? Like, Union Station is a crown jewel of downtown. And to be able to extend that kind of spending for the rest of downtown is going to be really, really cool. One thing that I'm excited about is sort of seeing, are they going to include some aspects of the 5280 trail, Wine Coop's on there, Sherman Street north of the Capitol's on there. There's a lot of opportunity to enhance the public realm. It will also be interesting to see what the city does regarding all that construction, given that the mayor is so focused on vibrancy right now. Will he want additional construction projects on some of these corridors? Or is he going to want to maybe postpone some of that and invest elsewhere? We'll have to see. That's what we'll do an episode on in the future.
That is the local ballot issues that we talked about. Mm-hmm. Should we move up to the state and to the regional level?
Right. Yeah. So we had, of course, a number of state elections happening, but the ones that are most important to the urbanist are probably the RTD elections. So we have 3 new RTD directors who are on the board. We have Chris Nicholson in District A. We have Chris Gutschenritter in District D. And we have Matt Larson in District E. And Chris Gutschenritter, please write in if I got your name wrong. I'm so sorry. But, who knows? We'll see what kind of effect they have. We passed something else that I think is going to have a big effect on RTD's service.
Yeah, so another tax measure, in this case, pretty wonky in Colorado. If you have a taxing authority, it's only authorized to spend money in a certain way under the Taxpayers' Bill of Rights. You can go to the voters and say, hey, can you just exempt that kind of refund mechanism that would or otherwise normally apply to us, the taxing authority? And voters can say yes. And so voters said yes. So we did not raise new taxes for RTD. We did not give them something that they didn't have already, but we allowed them to keep what they collect going forward, especially if there's sort of like a big boom time, they can keep that, or if there's a lean time and then a rebound. Like, there's some crazy estimates about the money that they would have had to have given back if this particular source of their sales tax revenue had been part of the sort of these Tabor limits before. I think that this was a quietly contentious one. Like, you'll see that this passed by a lot, but I had a lot of people text me and ask me ahead of time, I don't like RTD. I don't like how they're managed. I use their services or whatnot, but I don't like how they're managed. I want to send a signal. Should I vote yes or no on this one? And I just texted everybody back and said, look, I understand that you might have a concern. The governor agrees with you, right? There's a lot of prominent voices out there sort of criticizing the way RTD happens. But if you want the bus to come more frequently close to your house, cutting the funding to RTD is not going to make that happen.
Right. I think that is sort of where voters parsed this out, which is that less money isn't going to fix the issues.
Correct. And
I frankly feel that personally, RTD often does a pretty good job, but it seems to me that the fate of every transit authority across the United States is to be constantly hated by everyone, no matter how good you do. That might be a little soft on RTD. I have my complaints, but for all people don't like it, they recognize that this is an important service and deserves to be funded. So.
Yeah. And ultimately, anybody who texted me about it, I think they ended up voting yes on allowing RTD to keep this money.
Yeah.
So a big deal. I'll also say just at a state level, right? Over the last couple of years, we've obliquely mentioned some of these policies that have passed at the state level that are trying to promote transit-oriented development and housing abundance and more local money for transit, potentially money for, local rail services.
Right.
That has all happened under a Democratic-controlled state house and a Democratic governor. And I'll just shout out that one thing we didn't see in Colorado is we didn't see voters fall out of love with state control by Democrats. People are out there saying that we need a continued focus, right, on local solutions. And I'm happy to see that voters were able to understand that that's currently what Democrats in the state house are providing. I'm not like a partisan. Why am I doing a partisan bit here? I only mean to say that what has happened locally in the state house, right? Denver's the state capital. We have a lot of representation within the state house. We have said housing abundance is important, transit is important, safety is important, and we've passed policies that require the Colorado Department of Transportation to take projects and make them more multimodal, to take projects that would increase carbon pollution and either just take them totally off their planning or to try and mitigate as much as possible that carbon pollution. So voters are generally in favor of that approach, and that is going to stay the case here in the state of Colorado.
Yeah. Now let's turn our attention to the national level. In case you don't know, there is going to be a change of administrations this January. Trump defeated Harris in, like Andy mentioned, all the swing states. And so we are going to see a vastly different federal approach to many things, but including housing and transportation, funding, and development. We're going to focus on those two. We could, focus on other issues, but just to keep ourselves narrowly focused, we just want to do a little bit of a dive into this to understand how this might affect us here locally. So let's start at a national sort of infrastructure and transportation level. And you dug up some really great examples on how Denver recently has received federal funding to fund a number of projects in our area. Do you mind diving into that a little bit?
I mean, it's just got to be said that when the federal administration likes your project, you get $350 million at the drop of a hat, right?
Right.
So in Denver specifically, in the last 4 years, we have gotten a lot of money from the feds, over $300 million for ecosystem restoration to the South Platte River and also for flood mitigation along Weir Gulch and sort of the west side of town. Money from Reconnecting Cities, which is a grant program to try and connect places where highways instead of split them apart. That's specifically going to go to Globeville and Elyria Swansea. There's money for downtown safety projects, for Vision Zero projects, because downtown is a high injury network all on its own. There's money for lead pipe removals. And I just want to shout out our local heroes, right? Denver Water was already doing lead pipe removal under like a special permission structure from the EPA back in the Obama administration. And then when Biden came into office, that was like one of several things you'd actually just hear him say all the time, is that we need to remove lead pipes. So that came pretty much directly, from a very high level at the federal level. There's money for lead pipe removal for Denver Water, which has sped them up. Money for mountain rail, potential money for front range passenger rail. Right. That has come from the federal level, which would be a big boon, as we heard in a previous episode about Ward Station, for Arvada and some parts of the metro area that are underserved by transit. Money for building electrification. There was a big tranche of money, like over $100 million, that just went recently to Dr. Cog about policies for building electrification. And Colfax BRT, which we have spent very little time talking about on this podcast, but is going to totally transform one of our important urban main streets. They got the maximum federal grant from the New Starts sort of program within the Federal Transit Administration. So there has been a lot of federal money, and I'm just scratching the surface. Obviously, there was also ARPA money, so American Rescue Plan. There's so much more about rebates. Individual people are sort of experiencing that money coming into their life. But it just does matter. Like, we wouldn't be able to scrape $350 million together for the South Platte River. And in this case, we have that money now, and it's going to be a transformational project that is going to, change the city's relationship with one of the reasons that we're even here in the first place. So it's just a big deal. And I've made myself a little depressed. It's just a big deal, and that's all really good money. So it will be a shame if that turns off that spigot.
So when we turn to look at how a Trump administration will affect things like the Department of Transportation, the main mechanism that we're anticipating for this in the coming years is whether the bipartisan infrastructure law will be reauthorized. It's due in 2026. I anticipate that it actually will be reauthorized in some form or another. It'll be given a new name so that it doesn't carry the old Biden administration name. And the internal structure of it will be changed in a big way. But they're not just going to stop repairing roads and bridges and that kind of thing. And so to see what might change in this reauthorization, I tried to look at the Trump website and look at their issues page. There's just not a lot there. The Trump campaign was not very heavy on policy, unfortunately, and unsurprisingly. There is a little section on how we need to save the American auto industry and stop Biden's electric vehicle mandate. But that doesn't really tell us all that much. And so a lot of what we're going to be pulling from today's Project 2025, which is sort of the conservative agenda for a second Trump presidency. It talks about some classically conservative positions, which are maybe at odds with how Trump approaches policy. And so, for instance, Project 2025 criticizes the grant making that the Department of Transportation does and says that instead of making grants at a federal level and paying the states to improve their infrastructure, what we need to do is have user fees, toll roads on the roads, fees on flying. So if you're using this, you pay for it, which, again, sort of a classically conservative position, not going to happen. Just not going to happen. The Trump administration, more than anything, likes to be liked. And I can tell you the least popular thing is a toll road. So anticipating that, Project 2025 says, well, if we can't do user fees, well, we really need to scale back the amount of programs and grants that the Department of Transportation does in general, to shrink the Department of Transportation.
The discretionary grants.
That's right.
So right now, US DOT gets, X billion dollars a year. Instead of doing like little grants, hey, city, you get $150 million for your transit service, just block grants. Do I have that right?
Yes. So they are advocating for just block grants, sort of proportionally allocated to the many states. So on some level, if that happened here in Colorado, that wouldn't change our approach locally all that much. CDOT in recent years has pivoted toward more multimodal investment, toward more Vision Zero and climate-focused investment. And of course, we in the city are doing the same thing. And so here in Colorado, it wouldn't be a fundamental game changer for our infrastructure. Is that your impression as well?
We are really just speculating here. I do think that at the local and state level, we have put guardrails because we know that expanding highways just adds more traffic to those roads, right, and just increases carbon pollution. So what used to be the state highway administration or the state highway department, right, is now the Department of Transportation. And the Department of Transportation is coming forward and saying, okay, all right, well, we won't expand Federal Boulevard. We won't expand Colorado Boulevard. Well, how about this? How about we do a bus? How about we do BRT? I do think that the current process is preferable, but I do think that there are guardrails on the way that the state would receive that money going forward. Who knows, though, otherwise. Right. I think one thing that you pulled out that I was really interested in is specifically Project 2025, hates Vision Zero.
Yeah, so they call out Vision Zero specifically because they criticize it for causing congestion. And they say we need to stop using Vision Zero in the United States. I think this is pretty catastrophic as far as priorities go. It will probably affect how they evaluate grant applications if they do those. But I think any vote against Vision Zero from a federal level is just such a huge step back when we have this crisis of traffic violence on our streets today. The other things that I saw it called out is, of course, it wants to lower fuel emission standards for vehicles. They say it's making cars cost too much, and so we need to lower those fuel emission standards. They also, this is a bit wonky, but they want to eliminate California's emission exemptions, which are called the CAFE standards. For a long time, California has had this exemption to federal emission standards because they go above and beyond that. And as a result, because they are a huge market and because other states, including Colorado, follow their emission standards, auto manufacturers make their cars far more efficient because you don't want to miss out on California as a market. And so this has had this kind of nice effect where the government doesn't need to impose additional restrictions on a place that doesn't want them, like Missouri or something. And we still have the nice effects of better air as a result of cleaner vehicles. So the Trump administration wants to remove the CAFE exemption. That's also not a great thing, just for our air quality here. This shouldn't come as a surprise. It recommends defunding transit. They say it doesn't make its money back, and since it's not being run like a business, it shouldn't exist at all. We don't expect that from our other public services, but it really shouldn't come as a surprise that they are not interested in public transportation generally.
Yeah, that's pretty bad.
That's pretty devastating.
But I think if you are Austin, Texas, and you exist, right, in the context where you have a completely red state, Department of Transportation around you that is just happy expanding highways, and the Biden administration's DOT was able to cut you grants directly for the kind of multimodal projects you wanted to do, that's going to have a bigger effect in certain states than it would in Colorado. I think that's really kind of the point I feel strongly about here.
Yeah. Yeah, all of this, we all exist in the context of all that came before.
No. We're not going back to that. We're not going back to that. No.
Okay. So let's turn our attention to housing. The Department of Housing and Urban Development is a federal department responsible for housing in the United States. Like with the Department of Transportation, Project 2025 says, hey, we really need to shrink the size, if not eliminate this altogether. This portion of Project 2025 was written by the former HUD secretary, Ben Carson. This is a mix of things that you wouldn't be shocked to hear about on the Denver Urbanism podcast, and then also some pretty bad stuff. So I'll just start with that first stuff. They call out removing restrictions to housing, such as overly restrictive zoning and growth management controls, unreasonable maximum density allowances, historic preservation requirements, undue parking requirements, stuff that if you heard Andy and me talking about it, you would say, oh, cool, urbanist kings. But it is also mixed in with removing environmental protections to allow people to build housing where you can't currently right now because there are sensitive ecosystems, removing wetland regulations, and quote-unquote overly complex labor requirements, which to me just means removing labor protections. So there's some stuff in there that I'm like, okay, if they, eliminate parking minimums nationwide, then I'm all for that.
Sounds like a boon for urbanism. Amazing.
That's great. But some of this other stuff is pretty worrying particularly from an environmental perspective.
And again, it's a difference here of who has the actual authority to do some of these things, right? So we go back to the process, which is that locally, we have control over the rules around parking requirements, and at a statewide level, they just repealed parking requirements that affects most of the city and county of Denver. So it's not like the federal government can just sort of write a law, and that law says everybody has to do this now, at least not in the context of local zoning and land use. But they can say, here are the projects that we want to fund. Here are the types of projects that score better. Here is the guidance that all of the local state housing finance authorities have to follow when it comes to issuing LIHTC funding, for instance. So the federal government does have a big role here. They are a big source of money for project financing. Right. I'll say, I think another thing that is sort of a potential worry for me is that, like, right now, we don't have $100 million a year locally for affordable housing. Right. Most of the affordable housing, for deeply affordable housing that gets built in Denver, happens because of the low income housing tax credit, which was created years ago in this sort of wonky tax bill. LIHTC funding is limited. It's only like $2.80 a person or something like that. There's a floor for states, that have very small populations, but LIHTC funding, there's a certain amount of funding available every year that low-income housing developers can sort of apply for, use, and then typically they sort of sell that tax liability on. LIHTC funding makes things happen. We have so many great projects because those projects got LIHTC funding. And the really, really deeply affordable projects kind of require LIHTC funding for their projects to pencil out. You can't use LIHTC for single-family housing developments, for instance. That's just in the tax code. It has to be duplexes and above. That's pretty cool. Doesn't mean that all of the developments are like apartments with, only one parking spot for 10 people or something like that. So at that level of adjusting who is eligible for LIHTC funding and what sort of how LIHTC funding is given, that's a concern for me. There was in 2024, earlier this year, a compromise kind of like bipartisan tax bill that was introduced, that had a lot of support, not just from the president, but from Republicans and Democrats in Congress to expand the child tax credit and to reform LIHTC and to actually increase the total amount of money available for LIHTC and to sort of change in a wonky way, like private activity bonds that would go into LIHTC. All of that would make a huge difference to affordable housing production. But it's just way too soon to say, like, in what way these groups would actually want to go. Because I was encouraged by seeing that it was actually kind of the conservative principle there that said, let's broaden how LIHTC works instead of make it more accessible without, as much private activity with bonds. So anyways.
And to your point about sort of confusion about how this is going to go, if you do read through Project 2025 or some of these sections, you're going to notice a lot of contradictory sentences. For instance, one part says localities rather than the federal government must have the final say in zoning laws and regulations. And then later on, like 2 paragraphs later, it says a conservative administration should oppose any efforts to weaken single-family zoning. And this is a Ben Carson thing. The man loves single-family zoning. He views homes as first and foremost an investment vehicle and not as first and foremost a place where people live. And so it is too soon to say. I would hope that they lean on the principle of just allow people to build, but also the man likes single family zoning, and seemingly so does the rest of the administration. So we will have to wait and see. Unfortunately, we will wait with bated breath. I think another thing I want to call out is just like the xenophobia that is present in everything within this agenda here. Trump constantly blamed migrants for the housing crisis that we have in America. Clearly, that is not the case. We have not built enough homes. It is not migrants' faults, but he is using people's scarcity mindset about housing affordability and availability as a way to stoke fear against migrants. And that's terrible. None of these policies should ever be used to stoke that kind of fear. So anticipate all of these things being riddled with culture war over the next 4 years.
Let me tell you one thing I hope doesn't get riddled with culture war, right? My one weird pitch that I actually think people definitely didn't see it coming, right? In 2017, Trump and the Republicans that controlled Congress at the time passed the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act at the federal level, and that created like a totally new system about opportunity zones. And those opportunity zones, particularly in Colorado, there was an article in the Colorado Sun in 2023, we have like the second most productive use of those opportunity zones in the country.
Wow.
That was like a totally random conservative kind of policy. I'm just going to simplify it and say essentially it like gives a legal kind of rinsing money laundering for capital gains.
Yeah, right.
That's really what it is. However, it actually moved a lot of money that would have just gone into sort of rich people's pockets into new projects. I'll give you a couple examples of where you can find opportunity zones in Denver. One River North is in an opportunity zone, and that kind of part of Cole and Globeville. The entirety of the Park Hill Golf Course would have been in an opportunity zone. It was proposed there. Right by Colfax and Federal, where there's a lot of new apartments that have gone up recently, still more being built. That's an opportunity zone. So that was a policy that actually has really worked to drive more investment in projects. And that those projects don't have to specifically just be housing, but that actually just has worked. So there is going to be a vote coming up to potentially extend or enshrine the Tax Cuts and Job Act. And I'm just interested to see what happens there, because at least for my part, I would say that is like a weird policy that I don't know that the Liberals would have proposed. They probably would have just said, like, let's increase capital gains tax. Right. Who knows what the counterfactual would be? But in this case, it's just an interesting sort of effect that I think we didn't see coming. So you and I remain pretty open to just seeing, like, what happens and what will the effect of that thing be. I think we're both pretty miserable about the possibility of all of the nasty things that are going to happen. Right. But there just are ways that these things filter down to us at the local level. And we overperceive certain things and underperceive others. And we just wanted to kind of maybe right-size some of that here today.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you said, we are going to remain interested in seeing what happens. And ultimately, at this point, we're going to have little ability to affect some of those national decisions, but we're going to have a much larger ability to affect things locally in Denver. And so if you're feeling despairing, just know that there's a big opportunity here in the city to make it better for your neighbors, make it better for yourself. And we hope that the principles of urbanism and some of the stuff we talk about on the show enable you to do that and enable us to do that together.
A great example of that, James. Locally, this is a blue city. When Trump was elected in 2017, he ran on pulling the United States out of the Paris Accords. That was immiserating for climate activists and for people who really believe in science. And so at a local level, we decided as a city to take some steps, right? If there's not going to be federal action towards reducing carbon pollution and, increasing resilience against climate change, we had to do something. And so in 2019, Trump sort of like officially withdrew and sort of started this 1-year clock with the Paris Accords. And in 2019, City and County of Denver authorized the Climate Action, Sustainability, and Resiliency Office. In 2020, we officially withdrew from the Paris Accords very briefly. We were able to rejoin under the new president. In 2020, voters locally, not knowing the direction of federal policy, voted to fund a sales tax initiative that would then give money locally for climate action, sustainability, and resiliency. And that matters. Now people across the country are talking about like the way that we do our e-bike rebates and stuff like that as a national model. So there's just so many live possibilities for the way that a local political response to a national sort of political problem can actually like really transform how other places think about their own power and their own tools here. So I don't know. I feel optimistic that like the same talented, intelligent, action-oriented people that made Kaiser happen, which has just undoubtedly been a really big boon, for the city. I'm optimistic that those people are still here and they still care and they're still going to do hard work in the next couple of years.
I'm also optimistic. Definitely. Let's get to work.
Thank you for listening to the Denver Urbanism Podcast. It is a production of longtime blog Denver Infill and sister blog Denver Urbanism. You can find more information about the blog on denverurbanism.com, and we look forward to hearing you engage in comments online.
I just learned that the Winter Park Express is only going to be $20 or $19, I guess.
That's so sick.
That's so sick.
Yeah.
Like, that's a no-brainer.
It's also just a beautiful train ride. Like,
yeah.
if you, I mean, of all the things you could spend $20 on, it's a very beautiful train ride.
$20 on a lot of things. Mama.
Yeah.